In 1858 Natchez, Mississippi, a man's ruin was measured not just in money, but in human degradation. The cost of a $47,000 gambling debt was settled with the life of a single 5 months pregnant woman, locked inside a stone chapel with 4 enslaved men. This horrifying wager was the sport of the Magnolia Club, a secret society of powerful planters who perfected the art of betting on human suffering. By the time the sun rose, the daughter would be found alive, but unable to speak. The 4 men would have vanished, and a sealed letter would emerge to detonate the reputations of 2 of the South's most prominent families. What happened in those dark, enclosed hours was protected for decades by silence and wealth. But the truth, once buried, eventually claws its way out. If you want to know what they tried to erase, make sure you're subscribed to the Forgotten Liturgy. The architect of this cruelty was Colonel Augustus Fairmont, the bourbon-soaked master of Rosewood Hall. His daughter, Elizabeth, was merely a collateral pawn who understood her worth to her father was purely transactional. The monstrous terms were set by Judge Cornelius Draper. Elizabeth was to spend the night of November 14th with 4 of Fairmont's most respected enslaved men. Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaacor Fairmont would lose everything, including his plantation. Fairmont signed the agreement, reducing his own child to property. But the trap had a flaw. Elizabeth was calculating, learning the terrible truth from her loyal maid, Clara, and realizing that the families of the 4 men were being held hostage to ensure their compliance. She refused to be a victim. "They think I'm a pawn," she whispered. "I'll play too by my own rules." She blackmailed her stepmother, Constance, into becoming an accomplice, threatening to expose the entire scandal. The final layer of the conspiracy was the most dangerous. Elizabeth and Clara slipped into the locked storage building and stood before the terrified enslaved families. Elizabeth presented her plan, an audacious counter-conspiracy that required perfect trust and split-second timing from 4 men, who had every reason to distrust her, with the pact sealed by Rachel, Samuel's wife. The stage was set for a night where the victims would attempt to use the terms of the wager against their oppressors. "Why should we trust you?" Joshua asked bluntly. Elizabeth told the 4 enslaved men, Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac, they shouldn't, but she offered them agency, something denied to them their entire lives. If her plan worked, they would gain protection and leverage against future threats. "If we survive this night," she promised, "I'll do everything in my power to ensure you're never used as leverage again." Years of survival instinct led Samuel to agree. "We'll do it. God help us all." The remaining hours were spent in feverish preparation, collecting evidence, memorizing roles, and securing a sealed letter Elizabeth had carried for months. This letter contained 2 lethal secrets. The first was that the child she carried was not her husband's, and the second was a confession of a crime her father, Fairmont, had committed 15 years prior to hide his own mixed ancestry. In the chapel, Elizabeth told the men everything: the wager, the Magnolia Club's ledger of human stakes, and the full extent of her father's depravity. "The wager states, I must be intact in the morning," she explained. "They expect violation, but the terms specify only the outcome." She revealed the letter's purpose: mutually assured destruction. If Fairmont or Draper ever threatened the men or their families, the letter would be released to newspapers and courthouses, ensuring both families were instantly ruined by the revelation of miscegenation and hidden paternity. The plan was set. The letter would be hidden behind the altar. Elizabeth would emerge, traumatized and mute, a silence that would excuse her from testifying. The men would disappear that very night, using escape routes known to Isaac, while their wives created a diversion during the morning chaos. As a final measure, Elizabeth took a small knife, inflicted shallow cuts on her arm, and tore her gown to create the necessary appearance of brutality. "When they open that door," she instructed, "I collapse. I don't speak. The ambiguity protects all of us." At 6 a.m., the lock turned. Judge Draper, his witnesses, and a gray-faced Fairmont entered. Elizabeth lay on the couch, eyes unfocused, blood visible, body trembling. When Draper demanded she speak, she stared through him. Samuel, meeting Draper's eyes steadily, confirmed, "We did what we were told, sir." Exactly what we were told. The terms were met, the debt was cleared, but Draper was left utterly dissatisfied. The 4 men were escorted back to their quarters, knowing they were now targets. The official story claimed they escaped north, but whispers of them being hunted and killed by the river persisted. The truth, emerging in fragments over decades, was more complex. Elizabeth never spoke another word. She was diagnosed with hysteria and shock, and subsequently divorced by her husband upon his return. She gave birth to twins, marked by scars or birthmarks on their shoulders, and was exiled to a small cottage on Rosewood's edge. Augustus Fairmont, seeking either redemption or death, volunteered for the Confederacy at age 56, and was killed at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. His final, undelivered message was an apology to Elizabeth. Constance survived the war by methodically selling rosewood and navigating the social terrain by entertaining Union officers. The war freed the enslaved people who hadn't fled, scattering the 4 wives and children into the chaos of Reconstruction. Their reunion with their husbands unknown. Judge Cornelius Draper served as a Confederate military judge until his plantation was burned. Left with a scarred face, he became a recluse, wearing a black silk mask. His obsession with tracing bloodlines intensified to mania, spending his time desperately searching for something he never found. The cosmic balance shifted in 1871. By then, the original Magnolia Club members, except for the scarred recluse, Judge Draper, were dead, victims of war, fire, or nervous exhaustion. The infamous ledger had vanished. Elizabeth's twins, Sarah 12 and Thomas 11, had only known their mother's muteness, which served as a constant, unspoken testimony to the horror of that night. In the spring of 1871, a man appeared at their cottage, Samuel Garrison, well-dressed, and carrying papers identifying him as a freedman. Elizabeth, who hadn't visibly reacted to anyone in 13 years, immediately embraced him and wept. Samuel explained that all 4 men had made it north, purchasing land in Ohio, establishing a community, and spending a decade searching for the families they'd left behind. "Your mother saved our lives," Samuel told the twins. "We spent 13 years making sure we could honor that debt." He detailed the Underground Railroad network they'd built and offered the family a place with them in Ohio. Before leaving, Samuel gave Elizabeth a small locked box containing everything they had documented from that night. Copies of Elizabeth's original letter, affidavits from the 4 men given to a northern lawyer, and years of testimony. If anyone ever threatens you or your children, you have proof. Empowered by Samuel's return, Elizabeth began teaching freedmen's children in her cottage. In 1873, she took her children and the locked box to Harrison Fletcher, a northern lawyer specializing in Reconstruction cases, asking to file charges against Judge Draper and her father's estate for conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted assault. Fletcher, stunned by the sheer volume of evidence, 13 years of written testimony describing the entire system that made the wager possible, warned her of the enormous risks. Elizabeth wrote, "Silence has protected the guilty. It's time for truth to be spoken, even if I must speak it in writing." The case, Bowling versus Draper, filed in federal court, never went to trial, but its public filing documents were explosive. They revealed enough detail about the Magnolia Club to scandalize even Natchez society. Judge Draper fought aggressively, arguing the legality of property relations at the time and challenging Elizabeth's mute testimony. Constance begged Elizabeth to drop the charges, fearing the social ruin of Sarah and Thomas. Elizabeth's response was definitive. "I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking justice. My children will inherit truth, which is worth more than acceptance, into a society built on lies. The case was settled out of court in 1875. The terms sealed. But visible changes followed. Draper transferred substantial property to a trust for freedmen's schools, and the Fairmont estate was liquidated, with proceeds compensating families subjected to the Magnolia Club's wagers. It was not redemption, but it was acknowledgement. The settlement contained a final, unusual provision. All documents related to the case, including Elizabeth's journals and the letter, were to be sealed for 100 years, until 1975. This secrecy protected two devastating final confessions in Elizabeth's original chapel letter. First, the letter revealed that Augustus Fairmont's grandmother had been a woman of mixed race, passed off as white. In the 1850s South, this meant Fairmont should not have owned property, including people. Draper had suspected this was his true motivation for proposing the wager, hoping to expose Fairmont's tainted bloodline. Second, the letter revealed the true paternity of the twins. They were the result of an assault by Dr. Marcus Henley, Draper's own cousin, and a Magnolia Club member, earlier that year. Elizabeth had kept silent until the wager. This revelation meant Draper had inadvertently set up the exposure of his own cousin's crime. Elizabeth's perfect trap was built. While everyone underestimated her, the end of the war did not end the conspiracy's legacy. Constance Fairmont died in 1881, having confessed in a sealed statement that she participated in the evil, not out of sudden malice, but because Elizabeth's plan was her only path to survival. Judge Draper died in 1877, his final words desperately demanding, "The ledger. Destroy the ledger." The Magnolia Club's ledger, however, remained missing. In the years following the settlement, a supposed curse appeared to fall upon the families involved. 7 men connected to the Magnolia Club members died under suspicious circumstances. By 1880 some ruled accidents, some suicide. The truth, revealed in 1882 by a deathbed confession from a freedman named Abraham, was simpler and more human. He was systematically hunting and killing the members and their descendants. Abraham had stolen the ledger during the war and spent 15 years using it to identify those who profited from the human wagers. He killed 11 men, stating he was not sorry, as he could not let them live in peace while his people's suffering was forgotten. The confession was immediately suppressed by local authorities, and the ledger disappeared with him. Elizabeth lived until 1899, never speaking another word aloud, but filling hundreds of journals. Her school grew into a foundation for black education in Mississippi. In 1897, Isaac, the preacher from the chapel night, visited her from Ohio. He told her all 4 men had lived to see their children and grandchildren born free. Isaac said, they told the story so their descendants would know that in the darkest moment, a white woman chose to be human. Elizabeth wrote her final, powerful counter-testimony. "I didn't save you. We saved each other." Not that one person was heroic, but that in impossible circumstances, people on different sides of an evil system chose to see each other's humanity. That's the only way anything changes. The documents remained sealed until 1975, however. A graduate student named Robert Chen cataloged Elizabeth's journals in the 1920s and discovered coded passages referencing the Second Testament and the Carpenter's Gift. Chen became convinced that Samuel Garrison had created a backup archive, a complete duplicate of all the sealed evidence and more, and hidden it somewhere in Natchez as insurance against the destruction of the courthouse records. Chen died in 1945, but his final, sealed letter to the archives director, marked not to be opened until 1975, detailed his theory and the clues Elizabeth left behind. Meanwhile, a chilling campaign began in the late 1920s. Anonymous letters containing single photocopied pages of the missing Magnolia Club ledger were sent to descendants of the implicated families. The entries detailed their ancestors' specific, cold-blooded wagers, ending with the typed line, "The truth is patient, it can wait." Nobody knew the sender, but the letters forced a reckoning. Some families quietly began making amends, while others fiercely doubled down on denial. The truth had begun its slow, unstoppable emergence, forcing descendants to confront the documented crimes of their ancestors, just as the official archives were preparing to open, in the decades leading up to the scheduled 1975 document release. The sealed archive at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History took on an almost mythical quality. The contents were rumored to hold proof of murders, corruption, and scandals that would destroy half the state's old families. The truth, however, was simpler. It was about a system of systematic cruelty documented by its perpetrators, and the people who resisted it, before the official unsealing. The archive grew more complete. In 1944, historian Margaret Crawford, frustrated and dying, donated her entire research archive, including her unpublished manuscript, Wagers in Human Flesh, and all her collected ledger pages. She stipulated it be sealed until 1975, believing America would then be ready to face its history without flinching, without making excuses. In 1947, Grace Henderson, granddaughter of the stable manager, Marcus, added her grandfather's personal testimony, letters, and documents, ensuring the complete truth would be available. She asked the director if people would understand that survival itself was resistance. Between 1947 and 1950, 3 more descendants came forward, adding final journals from Elizabeth, letters about the search for the sold son, and sermons comparing the chapel conspiracy to biblical stories of resistance. The civil rights movement was simultaneously gaining strength, ensuring the documents would be received as evidence proof that slavery's cruelties were systematic and that resistance had always existed. The conclusion was brought forward violently in August 1949. Rosewood Hall, abandoned since 1881, finally collapsed in a summer storm. A survey team, documenting the ruins, discovered something under the altar stone of the chapel, a sealed iron box, containing a leather-bound book and a collection of papers preserved for 91 years. The leather-bound book was the Magnolia Club's complete ledger, meticulously documenting 237 human wagers from 1847 to 1865. Involving 53 plantation owners. Samuel, the stable manager, had hidden it, writing that he trusted the law only so far and hid the complete record in the last place they would look. The very ruins where the conspiracy began. The archives director, James Thornton, made a controversial but crucial decision. He had the original ledger, immediately sealed for the 1975 opening. But he authorized a complete photographic reproduction to be released to scholars immediately. The information in this ledger is too important to keep hidden for another 26 years, he announced. The release of the ledger photocopies in November 1949 triggered a firestorm. Descendants of the named families threatened lawsuits, demanding suppression. Thornton, supported by civil rights organizations and progressive historians, stood firm. The ledger's contents shocked the nation. It provided undeniable proof, in the perpetrator's own handwriting, of systematic cruelty treated as entertainment, wagers on torture, forced infanticide, and the chapel wager itself. The entry for the chapel night was clinical, terms disputed, matters settled privately, no amount collected. The release of the ledger in 1949 fundamentally changed the historical landscape, making it impossible to maintain romantic myths about slavery and proving that the resistance shown by Elizabeth and the 4 men was a necessary feature of a brutal system. The release of the ledger in 1949 was only the beginning. Historian Dorothy Cann's 1955 book, The Ledger of Atrocity, became the definitive account, selling over 100,000 copies, despite fierce controversy. Keen's key insight was that the conspiracy represented something more profound than mere Resistance. It was a moment where people from opposite sides of America's brutal divide chose trust over despair, cooperation over submission, and testimony over silence. That persistent, daily decision to recognize shared humanity, she argued, was how the system was ultimately defeated. As the years marched towards the scheduled November 14, 1975, unsealing, anticipation mounted. However, a near disaster in a 1968 fire prompted archivists to photograph everything, and during this process, they found a startling discovery in one of Elizabeth's sealed boxes, a final letter dated 1898. 1 year before her death, the letter revealed that Elizabeth had spent the last 40 years of her silent life engaged in a project no one suspected, using the settlement money from the 1875 case. She had been systematically purchasing the freedom and future of the descendants of those wagered by the Magnolia Club, anonymously, through lawyers and intermediaries. She spent nearly $80,000, essentially her entire settlement, to buy land in Ohio, Illinois, and Kansas, fund educations, and provide capital for 147 families. "I couldn't undo what was done," Elizabeth wrote in her final testimony, "but I could take the money that came from my silence and use it to help build futures for people whose pasts had been destroyed." Her campaign was not based on guilt or pity, but on the recognition that my survival and theirs were intertwined. The conspiracy that began in the chapel in 1858 had transformed into a deliberate campaign to redistribute stolen wealth back to those it was stolen from. Elizabeth's letter, along with the rising tide of the civil rights movement, gave the documents new resonance. Activists saw the chapel conspiracy as a model for interracial cooperation and resistance. Scholars began planning major publications for 1975. In 1974, a joint petition was filed by descendants of both Elizabeth's family and the four men, requesting that the unsealing be held, not in a sterile archive, but publicly, at the ruins of the Rosewood Chapel site in Natchez. Our ancestors created this testimony together. It should be revealed together in the place where it began, with their descendants standing together as they once stood, the petition stated. The archives agreed. The story ends in 1974, 1 year before the grand public unsealing scheduled for the 117th anniversary of the chapel conspiracy. The ultimate fates of the central figures became clear. Elizabeth Bowling died in 1899, her 40-year silence becoming the loudest possible testimony. She raised her twins, taught hundreds of children, and secretly bankrolled a movement to restore futures. Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac escaped to Ohio, built free lives, found some of their separated families, and ensured their descendants knew the story of survival and resistance. Constance Fairmont died isolated, having left a confession acknowledging her complicity and eventual choice to help, realizing too late the system built on cruelty would consume her. Augustus Fairmont died an unredeemed traitor to his family and his class. His final apology never delivered. Judge Cornelius Draper died, a reclusive morphine addict, haunted by his failure to destroy the surviving evidence. The final testament is that the truth survived. The ledger, the journals, the testimonies. They survived because people on opposing sides of an evil system chose to conspire, survive, and ensure the truth would out.